Hello, this is Ariadne Rainbird, and today I'm going to be talking about the Hebrew goddess. I'm basically giving a synopsis of the book The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai. The third edition of this book was published in 1990, so it's quite an old book, but I think it's an important book. And there are more recent, more modern books on a similar subject available now. But this was really the first book of its kind that really explored the divine feminine in the Hebrew religion, both in the Old Testament and in Judaism in later times. Raphael Patai begins by explaining that the Israelite religion of the Old Testament is not necessarily the religion of the common people, and he distinguishes between the religion of the prophets of Yahweh and the religion of the kings and the religion of the people. These are three different types of religion. It is the religion of the prophets which is expressed in the Old Testament, but it can be seen from the books of the Old Testament that the prophets of Yahweh were constantly in conflict with the kings, some of whom built temples to other deities, and with the people, who frequently continued to worship the deities of their ancestors or adopt deities of the lands in which they settled. Patai points out that the people known as the Hebrews or Israelites lived for centuries in a region which was rich in goddess culture and had a number of goddess worshipping cults, and that the Israelites themselves could not therefore have been immune to such cults. Patai argues that the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament does not accurately reflect the actual religion practiced by the majority, but was something which various prophets or priests of Yahweh demanded and forced upon them, with varying degrees of success. In the first two chapters of the book, Patai discusses the various goddesses whose cults were prominent in the region, and the various biblical references to their worship by the Israelites. Patai also points out that during the times of the writing of the Old Testament, and even in modern times, the Jewish religion has never had a monolithic central organising and controlling structure which could impose its authority on all Jewish communities, and that in biblical times, as well as today, Jewish practice and belief differs from place to place and depends on local culture. These first two chapters about the ancient Hebrew goddess are for me the most interesting. Patai says that the earliest known goddess worshipped by the Israelites was Asherah, and that she was worshipped from the time that the Israelite tribes arrived in Canaan down to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar 6 centuries later in 586 BCE. Other originally Canaanite gods and goddesses were also worshipped during this time. Patai argues that only intermittently, but with gradually increasing intensity, did the prophets of Yahweh make themselves heard and heeded by the people and their leaders. There were numerous references in the Bible to the people setting up and worshipping Asherahs, cult objects consisting of a carved wooden pole representing the goddess. Even so, Patai argues that the biblical accounts are later reworkings and not contemporary accounts, and therefore likely play down the worship of other gods. Patai also discusses the archaeological evidence which, although lacking in clarity, has unearthed a number of nude female figurines, although it is difficult to ascertain whether these were used by the Hebrews or the Canaanites, or possibly both. Patai also discusses post-biblical literary sources which were not subjected to the same revisions as the Bible, and which contain many references to early Hebrew polytheism. Biblical sources name three goddesses worshipped by the Hebrews up until the Babylonian exile: Asherah, Astarte, and the Queen of Heaven, who may have been Anat or Anath. Patai doesn't mention whether there is any evidence that the Hebrews had any goddesses of their own before they settled in Canaan, or whether they worshipped Egyptian deities when in Egypt, etc., but this is also quite likely. There are numerous biblical references to the worship of Asherah, as well as altars being dedicated to Asherah and altars to Baal. In the book of Judges, we hear of Asherah worship being a public affair. And when Gideon, a zealous Yahwist reformer, demolished the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah, the men of the city demanded his death. The Old Testament is full of conflict between the Yahwist prophets and priests and the worship of other gods, by not only the common people, but by leaders and kings. King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines from various lands, and allowed the building of shrines for all the gods and goddesses they worshipped. And Patai argues that Solomon's temple in Jerusalem was conducive to the establishment of a polytheistic, syncretistic cult, reminiscent to me of Alexandria after Alexander the Great. Solomon is described as having great wisdom in the Bible, and to me his tolerance of other religious practices sounds quite enlightened. But the prophets of Yahweh did not see it that way, and although what Patai describes as the Yahwist historian, i.e. writers and revisers of the Old Testament, say that although Solomon loved Yahweh, that he nevertheless sacrificed and burnt incense to other gods. And although Solomon himself was not punished by God for this, due to being a son of David whom God loved, that trouble would come to the house of David as a result. I'm left wondering why the Yahwist prophets were so fanatical and hateful towards other deities, when other cults were able to worship side by side without trouble. This is not something which Patai explores in the book. However, he does discuss how the psychological need for a mother goddess, the feminine archetype, persisted throughout the persecution by the Yahwist prophets, and still persists today. One question Patai does pose is why the Yahwist opposition to other male deities, such as Baal, was far stronger than their opposition to worship of Asherah, and he muses as to whether the goddess was seen as complementary to, rather than competitive with Yahweh, or whether it was simply that her worship was so deeply entrenched in the populace that the most zealous of Yahwists dared not take action against her. In his addendum to Chapter 1, written 10 years after the original edition, Patai describes an archaeological find from Kuntilat Ayud in northeastern Sinai, where 2 large pithoi or storage jars were discovered, dating to around 800 BCE. One of them carries the inscription, "Amariah said to my Lord, may you be blessed by Yahweh and by his Asherah." Another inscription from the same site says, "I have blessed you by Yahweh, Shmurun and his Asherah," meaning of Shmurun, uncertain, may mean Samaria. An inscription found 9 miles west at Kibet al-Kom says, "Uriah the rich has caused it to be written, Blessed be Uriah by Yahweh and by his Asherah. From his enemies he has saved them." Patai argues that these inscriptions show that in popular religion the goddess Asherah was associated with Yahweh, and that the 2 deities made up a divine couple prior to the reforms of King Joshua in 621 BCE. Another goddess mentioned in the Bible is Astarte, though far less frequently than Asherah, but Patai argues that archaeological evidence points to Astarte as well as Anath as also being an important goddess to the ancient Israelites. In later chapters, Patai presents a picture of how, as the prophets of Yahweh established more power and influence, and monotheism began to become more established, that the goddesses did not simply disappear, but underwent transformations, and that the divine feminine remained a strong influence within the Jewish and later Gnostic religion in the form of Shekinah, Sophia, the Matronit, and the Shabbat bride. And you see here the pithoi or ostraka from Kuntilat Ayud, and they have inscriptions to Yahweh and Asherah on them, and there's an inscription which appears to be a precursor to that which is in the Bible in Numbers 6:24 to 26. So the inscription on the pithoi is translated as, "Amariah said to my Lord, may you be blessed by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah. Yahweh bless you and keep you and be with you." And looking at a modern translation of the Bible, if we look at Numbers 6:24 to 26, it says, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. So the inscription of the Patai may have been an earlier form of that biblical text before Asherah was removed from it. And here also are some small statues, likely goddess figurines found in homes in Judah and Israel from homes near the Temple of Jerusalem. And these clearly show female images that may have represented Asherah or other goddesses. So back to Patai. In chapter 3, Patai also discusses the cherubim, which despite the Hebrew condemnation of idolatry and graven images, were represented as winged human figures which were said to decorate the Ark of the Covenant, and were an integral part of all Hebrew and Jewish sanctuaries and temples. In later depictions, they were represented as a male and a female in an erotic embrace. Patai argues that despite the Yahwist condemnation of worship of the goddess and removal of her as a consort of Yahweh, that the divine male-female pair continued to be represented within the most holy sanctuaries of the temples. Patai also quotes the 1st century CE Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who was influenced by Platonic thought, as saying the architect of the universe was at the same time the father of what was thus born, whilst its mother was the knowledge possessed by its maker. With his knowledge God had union, not as men have it, and begot created things. And knowledge, having received the divine seed, when her travail was consummated, bore the only beloved Son, who is apprehended by the senses, the world which we see. Philo describes the cherubim as symbolising the two most ancient and supreme powers or virtues of the divine God. Patai next goes on to discuss the idea of the Shekinah, which in the Talmud means the visible and audible manifestation of God, or of God's presence on earth. The term Shekinah does not appear in the Bible, but God was seen as descending into the temple on a cloud, which filled the temple with his presence. One of the names of the desert tabernacle was Mishkam, the dwelling. Shekinah means the act of dwelling, and originally meant that aspect of deity which could be apprehended by the senses. However, in late Midrash literature, the Shekinah came to mean an independent, divine and feminine entity prompted by her compassionate nature to argue with God to defend man. Patai argues that in the late biblical period there was a tendency to interpose personified mediating entities between God and man, which was seen as either created by God or to be his manifestations or attributes. The most frequently appearing of these is Chokhmah, or wisdom. Wisdom was particularly important to the Jewish Gnostics, who said that God created 7 archons through the intermediacy of his wisdom. Wisdom cast a shadow image upon the primeval waters, whereupon the archons formed the body of man, who crawled about like a worm, until wisdom endowed him with spirit. Wisdom was later formed into a deity, Sophia, to the Christian Gnostics, but in Judaism it was the Shekinah who became the main feminine aspect of the divine. And this became especially prevalent in the Middle Ages with the development of the Hebrew Kabbalah. The Shekinah is referred to a lot in the Zohar and later Kabbalistic works, and is often called the matronet or matron. The Zohar takes the 4 letters of mystic name of God, the Yod-He-Vav-He, as representing a divine family of 4, the father, mother, son and daughter. Chokhmah, wisdom, Bina, understanding, Tiferet, beauty, and Malkuth, kingship, which those who have studied Kabbalah will know as the spheres, some of the spheres of the Tree of Life. The daughter is seen as the central figure in divine happenings and relationships between the human and the divine. The matronet is the lowest of the 10 sephirah, the mystical aspects or emanations of the divine, which to some extent correspond to the Gnostic aeons. Patai argues that the matronet, the daughter goddess of the Kabbalah, is a true re-emergence of the goddess, and that she displays the same characteristics and contradictions of chastity, promiscuity, motherliness, and bloodthirstiness as in the ancient goddesses. She, as Shekinah, is a cup full of blessing, of which no one has tasted, unimpaired, virginal. In one aspect, the Shekinah is identified with the Holy Land. However, in contrast, she is wedded to the divine king, but also has sex with Satan, other gods and heroes of biblical history. The Zohar tells us that Jacob became the first earthly husband of the matronette, though he did not consummate the marriage until after his death. Her second husband was Moses, who once attached to her separated from his earthly wife and copulated with a matronette. When Solomon built his magnificent temple, the matronette made her preparations for her union with the king and prepared a house for him in which he could take up joint residence with her, and which, in a mystical way, was identical with the temple itself. A wedding of the divine king and the matronette took place each night in the sanctuary. When a pious earthly couple performed the sexual act, they set in motion all the generative forces of the mytho-mystical universe, much like the Great Rite in Wicca, and also tantric practices. When the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, the divine mating was disrupted and the matronette was banished from her holy abode and from the land of Israel. The king then took a slave goddess in her place, one of the handmaidens of the matronette. This was Lilith, who now assumed rule over the Holy Land. In her exile, the matronette was violated by other gods and the children of those other gods. The Gentiles were able to suckle from her just as the children of Israel had done. However, she continues to be attracted to the pious men of Israel, especially when they're engaged in study of the law or good deeds. Now, this is where I find it a little bit irritating, as it only talks of men and the male point of view. Men of good calibre make it a rule to sleep with their wives only on a Friday night, and when away from their wives, the Shekinah couples with them. But there's no explanation of what the women do. In the Kabbalah, there are various emanations of God, with Malkuth, or the Shekinah, being the lowest, who has in some way become separated from the divine, and there are many prayers for unification both in Kabbalistic and in Hasidic tradition. An announcement is made prior to a prayer or sacred action that the intention of the person doing it is to bring about the unification of God and the Shekinah. Recitations of the Tetragrammaton are used to this purpose, uniting the different aspects of God. I found this a bit odd, as there is little indication of what this does for the individual. Other traditions seek to unify the individual with the one, the soul with the divine. However, Patai does also quote Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who lived between 1645 and 1813, who said that by concentrating on the unification, one brings about a union between the divine soul and the light of God, and that there are two aims: to unite God and the Shekinah, and to unite the soul of him who performs the commandments with God. And this is very similar to tantric practice, when the kundalini is raised, the goddess who resides in your base chakra rises up through your spine and unites with Shiva, who dwells in your crown chakra. So you've got this idea that you are uniting goddess and God, but also uniting yourself or with deity when you perform kundalini yoga practices. Patai then goes on to describe a number of other feminine characters in Jewish literature, which I find less convincing, such as the Shabbat itself being a goddess, as the Shabbat or Sabbath is referred to in feminine terms and is poetically personified as a queen and as a bride. However, I feel this is a little bit far-fetched and is more poetic metaphor than the Shabbat actually being worshipped as a goddess. Patai argues, however, that the Falasha, the black Jews of Ethiopia, have taken that poetic personification a step further and have actually deified her. Their book Tizaza Sanbat, or Commandments of the Sabbath, describes the glory and greatness of the Sabbath, including her adventures, expeditions, and intercessions with God. She is described as a daughter of God and divine princess. Patai concludes that the religion of the Hebrews was at least a hint of the feminine in its God concept. At times, the feminine was pushed into the background. At other times, the feminine occupied an important place in popular religion and theology, at times even overshadowing the male component of God. Only in the most recent times was the female element eliminated amongst Reformed, conservative and non-Hasidic Jews. So that's the end of my summary of Patai's book. I would recommend that you read the book if you want to know more about it, about the subject, but also have a look at some of the more modern publications, such as When God Had a Wife by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, which was published in 2020, and discusses some of the same subjects, such as Asherah and the goddess in the Hebrew Kabbalah, but also discusses the divine feminine in Christianity. Thank you for watching. And if you have enjoyed this video and found it informative, then please do like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.